guys, this is your next video, and this video is called Weather. Remember that we've been setting the stage or the foundation for understanding weather, what happens from day to day, and how in Texas we can go from having 70-degree weather to the next day being 38 and freezing with some sleet. We've been talking about how the sun's energy comes down and goes through our atmosphere, and we learned that heat transfers through our atmosphere through something called convection. The hot air is going to rise and the cooler air is going to sink. Well, then the same thing happens in the ocean with the surface ocean currents. So we've got our global winds and we have our ocean currents. At the same time, remember that we have the earth rotating or turning and spinning on its axis. We learned last week that this causes something called the Coriolis effect, that all winds and ocean currents in the northern hemisphere are going to move to the right, and everything that's in the southern hemisphere is going to move to the left. Well, this week, we're looking at how weather actually occurs. So first, let me start off by talking about air masses. And air masses, remember I said that if the water is warm, then the air directly above it's going to be warm. And if the water is cold, then the air directly above it's going to be cold. So an air mass is just a collection of air with the same temperature, moisture content, is it dry or humid, and the same amount of pressure. So we classify them by maritime, which means over the ocean, or continental, which means it's over land. If it forms over the ocean, it's always going to be humid air. If it forms over land, it's always going to be dry air. And then we classify by temperature, tropical and warm. You guys are going to do an activity this week where you get to interact with these air masses. And these air masses form, but then are pushed along by these global winds that we talked about before, and they end up impacting and bringing all sorts of things with them. So what happens when two air masses happen to meet each other? Well, that boundary where those two different air masses meet is what we call a front. And ultimately, the amount of energy that a particular air mass has determines what kind of front is actually going to be occurring. So when we have a warm front, the warm air mass is going to have a whole lot more energy. And when it meets up with the cold air mass, it's going to come in on top. Because remember, the warm air is less dense, and so it's going to be a little bit higher up than the cooler air. On the flip side, if we have a cold front coming through, that means a cold air mass has a lot more energy. It meets up with a weaker warm air mass and it bulldozes, or it comes in up under the warm air mass and pushes it out of the way. Well, sometimes we have something called a stationary front, where the warm air and the cold air, neither one of them has more energy, so they're pushing up against each other, and it's kind of like a stalemate. That's when it'll rain for days, or it'll be really nice weather for days, when we have a stationary front sitting on top of us. And then the fourth kind is called an occluded front, where two stronger air masses that are cold are going to isolate the warmer air mass and keep it up from the ground. Well, dealing with warm air and cold air and the fact that it sinks or it rises is going to change something called the air pressure. And I will be the one, you've probably heard me talk about how I feel like barometer head when the pressure is changing. Or your mom may say, oh, I have a headache because the pressure's changing. Well, when the temperature of the air is cooler, that more dense air is going to sink down towards the surface, the ground surface, which then applies more pressure. This is what we call a high pressure system. The high pressure system is typically going to have nice clear weather, or whatever kind of weather is happening, it's going to stay happening with this kind of system. On the flip side of it, we can have a warmer, less dense air mass that's going to rise up from the surface, which lessens the pressure that's down close to us. This is called a low pressure system, and a low pressure system is usually going to change whatever kind of weather we have present. So rain clouds, storms, even hurricanes are going to be associated with low pressure. The air pressure is measured by a barometer, and air always flows from high to low. So what is weather? Weather is basically day to day, the precipitation, the pressure, the types of front, cloud coverage, the things that you see on the television. And a meteorologist is the person who studies this. Predicting weather is a science.